Welcome to the deep dive. Today we've got a really interesting source you brought in, How to Make Great Love to a Woman by Ann Hooper and Philip Hodson.
That's right.
And the goal, as we understand it, is really to get beyond just the basics of female sexuality, maybe find some more nuanced stuff, surprising insights even.
Exactly.
So our mission here is to really unpack this book, dig into the key ideas, and pull out the most valuable knowledge for you.
Yeah, and it's quite a comprehensive look. It covers, the physical side, the psychological, the emotional, all the bits that make up women's sexual desires and experiences.
Okay.
It goes through first moves, love, the actual, arts of good sex, keeping desire alive, even using things like erotic stories and sex mantras.
Mantras, interesting.
Yeah, and a really central point they make right off the bat is that understanding women sexually, well, it often needs a different lens than how we might think about men's sexuality.
So let's jump right in there. That foundational question the book tackles. Are women actually fundamentally different from men when it comes to sex?
Absolutely, yeah. The book calls it the great debate right at the start, this whole discussion about, are the differences innate or learned? And it's interesting how they frame it. They look back at things like Thurber's old war between the sexes from the 30s.
Right, classic.
And then moves through the feminist movements in the 60s and 70s, which really challenged all those traditional sexual roles and norms. Question male dominance even.
Yeah, those were definitely times of huge shifts in thinking about gender and sex. And the book looks at the science too, right? That whole nature versus nurture thing.
Exactly. They get into the research on biological differences. Hormones, for instance. They discuss John Money's early ideas about hormones potentially programming the brain.
Okay.
And the work by Booth and Dabbs. Their research suggested maybe a link between higher testosterone in men and lower marriage rates, maybe higher divorce rates too.
Wow, okay. So the implication is that testosterone, which we usually just think of as driving sex drive, might actually connect to relationship stuff more broadly.
That's the interesting angle they explore, yeah. It suggests it's maybe not quite as simple as more testosterone equals higher sex drive, full stop. It could be more complex.
That gives you pause. So it's not just a simple switch.
Seems not. They also touch on potential differences in brain organization. They reference Daniel Goleman.
Goleman, okay.
Yeah, he suggests maybe some variations in how male and female brains might specialize. Perhaps men showing more focused specialization, women maybe stronger socialization skills. They even kind of connect it to the higher incidence of Asperger's syndrome in men. It's an interesting point regarding social interaction.
Yeah, that does make you think about all the different factors potentially at play. What about those specific differences people often talk about, like aggression or spatial skills, verbal ability?
The book does note some general trends seen in surveys, like males often showing more physical aggression from a young age and often performing better on, say, visual spatial tasks or math tests. But they also highlight the debate around verbal skills.
Ah, okay. So it's not clear cut.
Not really. Some research suggests girls might be stronger verbally, but other studies don't really back that up consistently. It shows these aren't rigid boxes.
Got it. And then there's the other side on the nurture. How much does our upbringing, societal expectations about gender shape our sexuality?
Oh, that's a huge point in the book. Really critical. They talk about how adults often treat kids differently just based on whether they think they're a boy or a girl.
Right.
And they bring up John Money again, his strong belief in how upbringing and environment shape us, our behavior, even gender identity. That famous case study he did, the twin raised as a girl after an accident. They present that as a pretty powerful example of nurture's potential impact.
Yeah, that's a really striking case. So the takeaway isn't really nature or nurture, is it? It's more like an interaction.
Precisely. That's the argument. Both biology and our social learning play big roles, and they probably influence each other in really complicated ways.
Okay.
And the key insight here, I think, is that understanding these potential differences, whether they're biological or learned, isn't about locking people into stereotypes.
Right.
It's about getting a more nuanced picture. And that can actually lead to better relationships, a richer sex life. It offers a kind of optimism, that we can learn, we can adapt.
That makes sense. A good foundation. Okay, so moving on to the physical woman. What does the book highlight about the female body and sexual response?
Well, it really stresses the hormonal control, how hormones manage sexual drive, desire, arousal, orgasm. And it points out these levels aren't static. They fluctuate quite a bit. with the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, breastfeeding, after childbirth.
Right, those natural rhythms.
Yeah, and these hormonal shifts can directly impact how she feels sexually, her experiences.
Okay. What about the physical changes during arousal itself? What happens?
They describe a few key things. Muscle tension increases, like all over the body.
Hmm.
A lot of women get a sex flush, that reddening of the skin, often on the chest, face.
Okay.
And crucially, they talk about the clitoris just before orgasm. This versatile little organ, as they put it,
Yeah.
it often retracts slightly, pulls back a bit, and can be harder to find for a moment.
Interesting. That retraction sounds like it could be disruptive if you're not aware of it happening.
Exactly. The book warns that if stimulation stops right at that moment, arousal can actually drop,
Uh,
which leads right into a really massive point they make. The huge importance of direct clitoral stimulation for most women.
oh, okay, how important?
Well, they cite stats suggesting only about 30% of women usually orgasm just from intercourse or G-spot stimulation alone.
Only 30%. Wow.
Yeah, whereas something like 82% can climax with direct clitoral attention.
That's a huge difference. So for the vast majority, penetration by itself isn't typically the main event for orgasm.
That's the clear message. And they also, debunk the myth of simultaneous orgasm. Say it's pretty unrealistic for most couples.
Right.
And while talking anatomy, they briefly mention the G-spot theory, suggesting it might be a kind of evolutionary leftover,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a trace of what would become the prostate in a male fetus.
Huh. Fascinating. Like, there's still so much basic physical stuff to understand. Okay, now, the book also gets into the female psyche and the emotional woman. What's key there?
This is where they really hammer home that different approach needed for women's sexuality. They highlight that for many women, that emotional connection, the whole feeling around sex, is just paramount.
More so than the physical sometimes.
Often, yeah. They even bring up Freud's idea of 4 people present during sex,
Right.
and partners plus their fantasy lovers.
Right.
But then they add the parents, the influence of parents.
Parents. How so?
They suggest that your upbringing, how much warmth or sensuality, or maybe how much repression you experienced in your family, can really shape your ability to just let go, relax, lose inhibitions during sex.
Mm-hmm.
They even suggest an exercise. Thinking back to your earliest memory of being touched lovingly, not sexually, just
Yeah.
affectionately.
Yeah.
And they think insights from that can actually make sensual connection easier later on.
That's quite profound. It makes total sense that those early foundational experiences would impact our comfort with intimacy later.
Hmm.
The book also stresses love being crucial for many women's turn on, right? Contrasting it with men maybe relying more on the trappings of love. What's that distinction?
Well, they argue that while love matters to men too, obviously, women often have a greater need to feel loved, emotionally connected. The romance, the passion, directed at them as a kind of prerequisite for arousal.
Ah, okay.
We use the term romantic erotica to explain why things like historical romance novels are so popular with women.
Right, Mills and Boone and that sort of thing.
Exactly. It's not just about explicit stuff. It's about experiencing that desired romantic story, maybe filling a gap from real life.
So the emotional landscape is just as important, maybe more so, than the physical acts. What about societal pressures? Those sexy stereotypes the book mentions.
Yeah, that's another really critical point. They use a case history, a woman named Jana.
Okay.
She was very beautiful, conventionally attractive, so everyone just assumed she was super confident, sexually adventurous.
Well, just stereotype.
But the reality was, she felt really insecure, quite inhibited sexually. It really highlights how important it is to let your actual self show, not feel pressured by some external, often totally unrealistic image.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that pressure to fit some kind of mold. The book also brings in family psychology, cultural background.
It does. It explains how the patterns of affection, sensuality, or maybe the lack of it in your family can deeply shape your attitudes towards love, sensuality, how you express yourself sexually.
Mm-hmm.
They give examples like Paolo and Marie, where different cultural ways of handling anger actually caused big problems in their sex life. And also how deep-seated religious or cultural beliefs can create specific sexual assumptions, maybe difficulties.
So many layers beyond just the physical act. They even have a preliminary 6-point plan. And point 1 is just take your time on the first date. Why start there?
It really boils down to building a genuine connection first, avoiding that premature rush into sex that might feel overwhelming.
Okay.
It fits right in with the book's whole emphasis on the emotional and psychological side being so important for many women.
Right.
And it leads to a really key idea. The brain is a vital sex organ.
Right.
A woman's past, her conditioning, it all massively influences her response.
Hmm.
If her mind isn't engaged, positively feeling comfortable and safe, then just focusing on physical techniques probably won't cut it.
Okay, that leads nicely into first moves and falling in love. It sounds like the book points out a shift in who makes the first move these days.
Definitely.
Right.
They talk about how, partly thanks to feminism, women are much more likely now to initiate sexual contact.
Hmm.
They even mention an old telephone dating survey from the early 90s.
Mm.
Women worried men would think badly of them for calling first.
Yeah.
But the men surveyed actually said they'd be thrilled. They'd think highly of a woman who did that.
Huh. Interesting disconnect.
Yeah. So the book really pushes the importance of women using assertion techniques, making their own choices, not just passively going along with things.
A real move away from traditional roles. What about differences in sex drive? Testosterone comes up again here, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
And while testosterone is linked to sex drive in both sexes, the book stresses it's not simple cause and effect.
Okay.
There's a huge range of drives in both men and women, high, low, somewhere in between.
Right.
They mention a hormone-binding globulin that affects how much free testosterone is available, which might explain some variation. And significantly, testosterone therapy doesn't always fix low sex drive in men or women.
Suggests other factors are really important too.
Exactly. It's likely more complicated than just hormone levels.
So not just the amount of testosterone, the book talks about getting to know her sexual biography. What does that involve?
This goes back to really understanding her emotional history around sex and intimacy.
Okay.
The book suggests talking about things like her parents' attitudes, were they sensual, reserved, her first discoveries about sex, the impact of early relationships.
So quite personal stuff.
Yeah, but the key is reciprocity. Mutual disclosure. You share your stuff too. It builds understanding, helps you see where each other's coming from.
Builds intimacy through honesty. Makes sense. They also suggest small touch moves to build more physical ease. What kind of things?
Just simple, non-sexual touches that increase comfort and connection.
Think?
You know, a warm handshake, a light touch on the arm when talking, maybe an arm briefly around a friend's waist, greeting friends with a quick cheek kiss, where appropriate, obviously.
Uh-huh.
The idea is just to normalize touch beyond purely sexual contexts. They also suggest shared sensual experiences that aren't intercourse-focused, like swimming together, water play, building intimacy through shared senses.
Nice ideas for connecting differently. Then the book moves into love itself. Anne's description. And John Lee's 3 love styles. Tell us about those.
Well, Anne's description is very personal, emphasizing how she feels different kinds of love, warm, affectionate for different people, partners, kids. It's multifaceted.
Okay.
John Lee's framework is more analytical. He identifies 3 main styles, arrows that immediate, intense physical chemistry.
Right. Passion.
Ludus, more playful, maybe less committed, focused on enjoyment, the game of love,
Yeah.
and storage more like a deep friendship that grows into love, enduring companionate.
Different ways of loving.
Yeah, and the book suggests knowing these styles helps navigate relationships, especially if partners have different primary styles.
That seems useful. The book also tackles some common myths of romantic love, right?
It does, yeah. Uses psychological research to kind of debunk some popular beliefs,
Like what?
like the idea that women fall in love more easily. Research often shows women fall after the men already have feelings.
Oh, interesting.
And the myth that men leave marriages more often. Divorce stats actually show more women initiate the split.
Huh. Okay.
Also, the idea men don't like women making the first move. Research suggests men often welcome it, appreciate the enthusiasm.
Well, write that dating survey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, the myth, we're most drawn to exotic strangers. Actually, we're more likely to connect deeply with people who are familiar.
Fascinating how those myths persist. What about the Romeo and Juliet syndrome and the biology of love?
The Romeo and Juliet syndrome is basically how parental opposition can backfire, making the couple feel even more intensely romantic.
Right. The forbidden fruit effect?
Kind of, yeah. And biologically, they touch on how falling in love might foster openness and trust. But the main point is developing love skills, understanding your partner's background, paying attention to small differences, really making an effort.
So nurturing love takes active work and deep understanding. What about distress signals and the link between childhood affection and adult sex life?
Yeah, they identify 2 main signals. One is being cranky, argumentative, often stemming from unexpressed worries.
Mm-hmm.
The other is quiet withdrawal, maybe signaling giving up, emotional disconnection, even depression.
Okay.
The book stresses offering reassurance, trying to understand if maybe childhood stuff is playing a role, And they cite that University of Colorado study,
Yeah.
finding a link between less physical affection in childhood and maybe less satisfying adult sex lives. Interestingly, they also note girls often have lower thresholds for touch and pain than boys and are generally more responsive to touch.
That really highlights touch again, especially for women. The book gives practical tips for starting, like just hand placement.
Exactly. Start simple, place a hand,
Yeah.
then experiment. Firmer pressure for security, lighter for playfulness, fingertips for arousal, maybe even light fingernails for a different sensation.
Okay.
And using warm massage oil if a longer massage feels right as a lead into sex.
Got it. Okay, we've covered a lot on the emotional and psychological side. Now, the arts of good sex and more arts of good sex. Here, the focus shifts more to the physical, right? Stirring sensation.
That's right. They talk about female pyrotechnics and pelvic throbbing. They reference Masters and Johnson's research on the orgasmic platform that's swelling in the outer vagina and tenting the expansion deeper inside.
Uh-huh.
They suggest maybe focused body friction combined with kissing before intercourse might lead to that intense throbbing feeling.
Interesting idea, combining different stimulations for a bigger buildup. Then they get into kissing, mentioning the Kama Sutra, and a description of a transformative kiss.
Oh yeah, they really stress that kissing is way more than a quick peck.
Right.
They describe a whole range: shy, tentative kisses, deeper affectionate ones, firmer lingering ones,
Okay.
even more passionate stuff like hard kissing, gentle biting, how different kisses signal different levels of desire.
Sounds like kissing itself can be incredibly intimate and a huge part of the connection. What about the mind's role in female arousal?
Huge emphasis on the brain again. They mention Janet achieving self-excitement just through erotic thoughts,
Wow.
and Masters and Johnson finding that longer tease, more buildup, often leads to deeper orgasms. They also touch on fantasy differences.
Yeah.
Men often reporting more explicit visual fantasies, while many women find romantic, atmospheric scenarios more arousing.
So again, it's often the feeling, the narrative, not just the visuals. The book gives erotic ideas beyond just genitals, right?
Yeah.
Focusing on kissing and touch all over.
Exactly. Exploring touch behind the knees, on the labia,
Yeah.
specific oral techniques with names like ice cream lick, the lipstick, snake tongue.
Evocative names.
Yeah. And they also address nudity inhibitions, stressing a comfortable private atmosphere, maybe soft lighting, candles to set the mood.
Ambiance definitely matters. They get into specific touch and oral sex techniques too, and common mistakes men might make.
Yes, they advise against being too rough or too fast with clitoral stimulation during oral sex.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it lubricated, use subtle, varied tongue movements, not just a rapid back and forth. And caution against too much suction can actually desensitize the area.
Really practical, valuable tips there. Then love positions, with the key point being that direct clitoral stimulation is vital for many women's orgasms.
Absolutely vital.
Mm.
They describe positions like under your thumb, basically
Yeah.
missionary, but the man uses his hand for direct clitoral stimulation.
Combining penetration and manual stimulation.
Yeah, okay. Also, woman on top variations, rear entry or doggy style, suggesting adding manual stimulation there too, the G-spot special other variation.
Okay.
For each, they discuss pros and cons for clitoral or G-spot access. The main message is, here are ideas, but spontaneity matters too, and knowing how to ensure clitoral stimulation in different positions can make a huge difference.
Got it. Okay, now, the Mr. Darcy factor, using erotic narrative. This links back to that romantic erotica idea, doesn't it?
Precisely. It explains women often respond differently than men to erotic material. Mood, romance, suggestion are often key, more so than just explicit visuals.
Uh-huh.
The popularity of Mills and Boone, the whole Mr. Darcy archetype, brooding, romantic, powerful, they use these as examples.
Right.
Then they give fantasy examples, from milder ones like a sensual swim to less mild like an audition scenario, and then excerpts from stronger fantasy stories.
What do those stronger fantasies show about women's erotic interests, according to the book?
Well, the taking risks one shows a woman bored with routine, getting aroused by an unexpected encounter, a shift in power dynamics. It emphasizes sensuality beyond just standard intercourse.
Yeah.
The Arno Sea change, one explores pleasure in passivity, maybe less conventional expressions of sex. These examples really show the diversity and nuance of female desires and the power of narrative and suggestion.
So interesting how different that sounds from typical male erotica tropes. Okay, how do we keep that desire going long term? The book covers that too.
Yes, definitely. They stress how important secure attachment is, the pain of separation. They mention Allred and Paduska's finding that just understanding problems isn't enough. You need behavioral exercises for real change.
Right, action is needed.
And they talk about how couples often stop working on the relationship when things are good, but conscious effort is always needed.
So what strategies do they suggest for keeping desire alive?
They bring in Dr. John Gottman's research on marital styles
Oh, yes, Gottman.
and his crucial ratio: 5 good interactions for every 1 negative one. Strokes, he calls them.
5 to 1. Okay.
What are good strokes?
Things like verbal affirmations, saying thank you, small gifts, physical touch, really listening, saying you're happy, giving compliments, apologizing sincerely.
Basic kindness and appreciation, really.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they also list Gottman's 4 horsemen to avoid contempt, defensiveness, criticism, and stonewalling.
Right, the relationship killers. How does this connect specifically to sexual desire?
Well, the book emphasizes communication, negotiation, comfort, trust as vital for good sex. They mention the paradox, sometimes wanting the forbidden, and
Uh-huh.
paradoxical therapy for performance anxiety, like temporarily banning intercourse, can actually lower the pressure.
Interesting approach. They also explain sensate focus, non-demanding touch exercises, starting without any goal of intercourse, just rediscovering pleasure.
Okay.
And they suggest scheduled sex or intimacy time, just to make sure connection doesn't get lost in the shuffle of life, plus taking breaks from stress to recharge.
Scheduled intimacy. Sounds a bit unromantic, but I can see the logic of making it a priority. Any other practical tips for enhancing intimacy?
They suggest a man maybe take the lead in learning about women's sexuality, sharing interesting bits from books, but gently, not overwhelming her.
Okay.
Mention Kegel exercises for pelvic muscles,
Yeah.
and lots of general tips.
Like,
Like explore what really turns her on, try intimacy without intercourse, encourage open talk about needs, increase general non-sexual touch, be affectionate without expecting sex, don't force responses, let arousal build naturally, take turns initiating, and focus on the who your partner, not just the how, the techniques.
really emphasizes connection and individuality. And massage comes up again as a way to build intimacy.
Yes, strongly. They give basic techniques. Circling motions, varying pressure, using fingertips, keeping hands warm, using oil, slow movements.
Okay.
They share Ray Stubbs' advice. Start with whole body massage before focusing on sexy bits. His duck's bill pour for applying warm oil to genitals.
Tuck, spill, pour.
Yeah. The pulling technique for gentle vaginal stimulation, ending with a touching off, lightly skimming hands over the body. They even mention his advanced 3-handed massage for deeper connection.
Wow, massage sounds like a whole art form in itself for sensuality. Okay, finally, life is a sensual experience, and using sex mantras, what's the core idea here?
Basically, it's about fully experiencing and appreciating the present moment, savoring the here and now, not dwelling on negatives or worries.
Mindfulness, almost.
Kinda, yeah. They acknowledge people and relationships change and encourage focusing on the positives, the current gains, suggesting positive affirmations about your lover, your relationship.
So cultivating a positive mindset and the sex mantras, how do they fit?
The book presents them not as empty chanting, but as simple, strong phrases to reinforce positive intentions and beliefs.
Okay, like what?
They list several, like,
Hmm.
I approve of myself. I am free to be loving. I am happy with my sexuality. I choose to accept sensuality freely and flexibly. I am loving and enduring. I recognize my body as a fount of sexuality. Others for men too, like, I am safe to be male. The idea is using these affirmations consciously to build a more positive, accepting view of sensuality, sex, and love.
Like consciously shifting your internal dialogue. Well, this has certainly been a deep dive into how to make great love to a woman. It's so clear that understanding female sexuality is incredibly rich and complex.
Absolutely. The key takeaways really revolve around that crucial emotional connection for many women. The prime importance of clitoral stimulation for orgasm for most, the huge power of the mind in erotic stories, the way sexual dynamics evolve, and just the ongoing need for communication, touch, and real effort to keep a sexual relationship fulfilling.
Yeah. You know, considering all this emphasis on emotional connection and how individual female desire really is, according to this source, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How could changing the way society talks about sex and intimacy actually create more room for everyone, regardless of gender, to explore things openly and find what truly works for them personally?
That's a really interesting thought.
Definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.